commentator on Al Jazeera, Russia Today, Al Fura, and Dubai One. He's also worked at OPEC in the legal department and at the Oxford Institute of Energy Studies. So we're very honored to have him, and I hope that his presentation will spark a lot of debate and conversation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the excellent introduction, Teresa, and it's good to be in Brussels again. I was here before through the kind hosting of Teresa and the EIAS for our previous discussion, so always good to be back. What I'm going to speak about is some research that I've been conducting in terms of energy cooperation, or the lack thereof, in Northeast Asia, and basically discuss, as my main thesis proposes, that energy and environmental cooperation within the region can be a spur for other cooperative enterprises, such as geopolitical cooperation and what have you, and also due to a type of lessening of a certain tension within the region. So, as most of you are, of course, aware, the Northeast Asian region has been able to escape somewhat some of the ravages of the global financial crisis. And as a result, the region has been growing quite robustly in terms of economic growth and what have you. But as all of you know, as economic growth increases, at the same time, energy demand rates increase following that. So if we look at just the basic facts and figures of the region, just so we can put everything in context, the region accounts for about a quarter of the world's GDP in nominal terms, and the population is about 45% or so of the world's total. It also accounts for about a third of global commercial energy consumption, and at the same time, it also comprises about 40% or so of carbon dioxide emissions, and of course all of these are increasing as well. All these figures that I stated in terms of population, carbon dioxide emissions, and also energy consumption, and so on. And most of this is due as a direct result, of course, of economic growth in the region. So while the global financial crisis has impacted most of the developed world, Northeast Asia has been able to still show quite a robust economic and financial growth, but there are still some notable challenges in the region as a result, and they have to come up with quite comprehensive and collaborative initiatives and policies in order to deal with this over the coming decades. And this must be done at a regional level, so this can't be conducted unilaterally, not at all, because the countries in the region are actually in the same boat for the most part. So by 2020, China and India, both of which of course have a burgeoning middle class, are going to produce, it's actually forecast, it will produce much more in terms of carbon emissions than both the United States and Europe combined. And already, Asia actually imports about 60% of its oil from the Middle East, and Asian dependence on the Middle East is growing. And this causes a few problems if we look at two interrelated, somewhat interrelated issues that are currently in the Middle East region. One, of course, is the Arab Spring, and the repercussions of the Arab Spring could cause some issues in terms of the region to be able to continue to export a stable supply of energy to Asia. And then, of course, the other is Iranian nuclear crisis. And the Iranian nuclear crisis, it's still quite unsure as to how that is going to play out in the end. And of course, if there is any type of military action against Iran by either Israel and or the United States and its allies, and it will obviously cause some significant problems in terms of export from the region, because it is my belief that the Iranians will carry out their threat on blocking the Strait of Hormuz, and this would cause significant problems for Asia, as the majority of its energy is sourced through this region, and the majority of the exports are exported through the Strait of Hormuz. So these are some of the problems, and if we look at, as the region continues to develop and grow, there are four main strategic challenges that the region has to grapple with. One is security of energy supply and or demand. Another is economic efficiency of the energy sector. And then the third one is social equity. And in particular, if we look at access to consistent and stable and clean energy. This is also an issue. And as the economic inequality of the region grows, pace, of course, with the economic growth of the region, then this issue is going to become much more problematic, particularly if we look at China as an example. And then lastly, another important issue is reduced emissions of pollutants from energy production and use. So if we look at regional cooperation will be able to tackle at least two of these issues. And these two issues are principally environmental security and energy security, and I will show how these are interrelated. So if I were to define environmental security, this basically stresses that ecological degradation, resource scarcity, and population pressures are a source of conflict. And what do I mean by a source of conflict? In the sense that, i.e., environmental conflict can cause, or environmental degradation or problems can cause conflict in the region. But also conversely, if we consider the fact that regional cooperation on environmental issues can also play a major role in trust building and also confidence building within the region, and could potentially enhance regional peace. And then we could frame this in the construct of that environmental cooperation could, unquote, cause peace in that sense. So the environmental security framework within the region incorporates energy use as a major source of environmental problems due to pollution and carbon emissions. Now, when we consider energy security, the main understanding that we should take away from this is that it stresses the need to reduce, or to take measures to reduce vulnerability in terms of the national energy supply, specifically in terms of reducing dependence on foreign oil. And when we look at the measures that are taken to attempt to grapple with this, we can see that one is energy diversification within the region. Another is developing alternative fuel sources. Another one is also alternative energy technology, and also strengthening this demand side management, and also engaging in preventive diplomacy amongst or along vital sea lanes. Because if we look at strengthening demand side management within the region, it's still one of the most energy intense regions in the world. So we could say that that's very much a low-hanging fruit, whereas the region would be able to reduce a fairly significant portion of its energy consumption through tackling its energy efficiency in terms of demand side management. So as I stated earlier, it's a fundamental truth that as economic growth continues in the region, it's quite necessary to have a secure source of energy to power the economy. So if we look at the surge of energy demand that is following economic growth in the region, then this shortfall for the first time basically created a report. It was a quadrennial security review report. And basically this report indicated that climate change going forward is going to be one of the most significant geopolitical threats that we know of, and that it has a type of cascading effect in many countries in the region, particularly emerging markets that may not have the infrastructure in place to deal with refugee flows, to deal with conflict in light of these potential refugee flows as well. And the conflict that could result from that is that when you have environmental refugees that, let's say, move from one area to the other, the established population within one area might not like the fact that there is an increase in population due to residents from other regions. And this has already been a concern in terms of migratory inflows, not necessarily environmental refugees, but in terms of migratory inflows within Asia. We can see that in China, for instance, in the Xinjiang region, that has been a persistent source of conflict between the residents that are already there, particularly the Uyghur people, and then also the more ethnic Han Chinese. So we can see that going forward, if climate change does initiate a type of, let's say, movement, a large movement of peoples, even within a particular country, it could spur ethnic conflict. So that is quite a significant problem. And then the other way that I see climate change potentially impacting the region is through the limiting of carbon emissions and what the region is going to do in terms of developing consistent and stable policies to be able to transition away from fossil fuels to more renewable energy. So in 2011, this past December of 2011, this past December, the Durban Agreement was at least agreed in principle by most of the countries in the world. And what I thought was a bit of a revolution was that finally China, India, and Saudi Arabia agreed in principle that they will begin to lower their carbon emissions and agree to a set of internationally binding limitations, carbon emissions limitations. Now, this is something I think of significant importance because up until this 2011, China and India and also the Gulf countries had more or less resisted quite robustly any imposition of internationally binding carbon emissions limitations on their countries. We saw the failure of Copenhagen as a prime example in 2009. So the fact that these countries agreed in principle to lower their carbon emissions, I think is phenomenal. And even the conceptual revolution that occurred in light of that, because I would travel to the region often, particularly in the Middle East, and without any irony, policymakers would tell me, for instance, that they thought climate change was a hoax perpetrated by Western countries in order to set a type of impediment or handicap on the economic growth of their countries. And without any irony, many leading intellectuals and scholars in the region actually felt this way, and also policymakers. So the fact that they agreed upon this, I think, is quite phenomenal. So these two aspects of how the region is going to deal with climate change in terms of hard security issues and also in terms of energy issues, I think is going to be a significant issue going forward. And also, if you look at ecological stress and also climate change and how it could exacerbate international political tensions and potentially increase competition over scarce resources, I think that this also would play a role, at least for the next 2 decades, in how the region is going to be able to develop regional policies to attempt to deal with this. So what I propose, and at least what has been undertaken, at least in the initial steps by some regional institutions, has been the creation of some type of regional integrated cooperative framework that would be able to deal with a host of these issues at the regional level, whereby the countries would be able to build confidence amongst themselves and be able to develop consistent policies whereby they realize that it's not a unilateral process and that they're all in the same boat together. But significant problems, though, in the creation of any type of regional collaborative enterprise is that if you look at, for instance, that energy planning is most often conducted at the national level, and that it's principally undertaken by energy ministries, and most of their methodologies are still within this type of hard security threat perception analysis. So many of the countries, for instance, view energy security as being a zero-sum game, for instance, so that there's only one winner and that there are other losers. So change in thinking still has to be conducted at that level. And then also, if you look at issues of regional security, these tend to be handled by military and foreign ministries. And again, these officials have been trained in conventional threat perception as well. So they haven't yet really understood that many energy and environmental issues could be, let's say, solved or resolved to a significant degree by using a multilateral, perhaps soft power, analysis. And of course, it's quite understood why many of these states in the region are more or less hard states, One, of course, is the legacy of the Cold War, which still lingers in the region. North and South Korea is one of the primary examples of that. But then also you have the fact that there's still considerable animosity in the region over some of the practices of, or the imperialist practices of Japan, for instance, which still causes considerable animosity in the region amongst the neighbors. So even building trust upon some of the past practices is still difficult in the region, even in South Korea and Japan, which face the brunt of many of Japan's imperial policies. So the historical tension is still an issue if we look at around 60 plus years after the end of World War II. So it's still a considerable issue which causes obstacles for regional cooperation. And then if we look at the creation of environmental agencies in the region, many of these environmental agencies are quite new. They're not really staffed by individuals that necessarily understand all of the nuances of why environmental planning is important. And also, many of their mandates are quite narrow. So the environmental agencies in the region are not really able to take quite a robust, let's say, step towards combating environmental problems within the country, as economic growth tends to take precedence. So in order to develop regional cooperation, there really has to be an understanding how supply diversification and close proximity between the countries of the region could create a much more stable platform for energy importation, also utilization of energy sources. And also, if you look at joint resource development, this will also encourage infrastructure development as well, and investments. And it will also encourage as well, due to the spillover effect, technology transfer and development, and also encourage FDI within this sector as well. So if the region really takes advantage or attempts to leverage its geographical proximity, then the interconnection of energy infrastructure would really aid in terms of the flexibility and stability of the regional energy supply system, and would also be able to allow a type of joint platform that would begin to cope with some of the environmental concerns in the region by enabling utilization of less carbon-intensive energy sources. And I would say that natural gas and hydropower are two sources of energy, I think, that would be able to take a very large chunk out of some of the carbon emissions in the region. So it requires it requires an understanding that multilateral cooperation amongst the countries of the region is a necessity. But this is quite difficult in the region, because if you look at the fact that the interests, the national security interests of the country, the national economic interests of the country tend to differ, and sometimes they're in conflict. And also, if you look at how the states are constructed in terms of the political systems, they tend to be quite different as well. If you look at China, for instance, China has quite a statist approach, and still, I guess, is nominally communist, I suppose. And then if you look at North Korea, South Korea, I mean, so you still have very different political ideologies within the region, which is quite a contrast, for instance, if you look to cooperation within Europe, for instance, or even Latin America, or the Middle East to a certain degree. But one comforting side, though, of potential energy cooperation is that the possibilities for benefits are so great that it outweighs the disadvantages, and that it is in the practical interest of each country in the region to try to resolve these energy cooperation challenges through dialogue and negotiations, and also to set up a clear vision for energy cooperation, and also to provide some type of institutional framework which would be conducive to implementation. And then in order to ensure successful implementation, there has to be a clear roadmap. So it can't be done at quite an ad hoc level. It really has to be that the countries in the region get together and they understand what is the ultimate goal, and then they set certain targets to meet that goal. So to develop quote-unquote roadmap to meet that. And then, if all these are instituted, then if you develop some type of institutional framework for multilateral regional energy cooperation through treaties, charters, and regional energy communities, then this could also be a platform for further cooperation and stability in the region in other sectors. So if you look at certain conflicts that arise out of what countries perceive to be their maritime boundaries in the region, I think also environmental and energy cooperation could serve to resolve some of these issues. And this is quite a problem in the South China Sea, for instance, as we've seen as of late, and also emergent tension between the Philippines and China, and also Australia to a certain degree in China as well. So if there is a multilateral type of institution set up to deal with these issues, then I think many of the fears that countries in the region have over the supposed thrust of China's foreign policy, I think could be mitigated. And also more transparency would be needed on the side of the Chinese as well to communicate that they don't necessarily want to have a hegemonic role, or at least in the military sense, in the region. And there have been already some positive steps that have been